It was one of those evenings when the world outside seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath, waiting for something meaningful to happen, and Keanu Reeves felt that familiar heaviness in his chest. The mixture of anticipation and vulnerability that always surfaced when the past was about to collide with the present in a way he couldn't fully predict, especially now as he sat beside Sandra Bullock in the car, driving toward the home where he grew up. Where memories were stored like folded photographs tucked inside invisible drawers. Memories he rarely touched but never truly escaped. Memories that shaped him into the man he tried every day to be, gentle, humble, sincere, and painfully aware of the fragility of life. Sandra sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap, trying to hide the nervousness she felt even though her smile was calm, warm, and steady. The kind of smile that had seen storms and sunlight and learned how to hold both without breaking. She glanced at him as the road curved, her eyes catching the faint glow from passing streetlights, and she could sense the emotional weight he was carrying because Sandra, with all her brilliance and intuition, had learned long ago that Keanu's silence was never empty. It was full of thoughts he was scared to release and emotions he fought to protect simply because he cared too deeply. She reached out, gently touching his arm, and whispered, "You sure you're ready?" And he breathed out slowly before nodding, because even though he wasn't fully ready, he also knew something inside him longed for this moment. The moment he would finally allow someone he truly cared about to step into the private chapters of his life that he had kept hidden from the world for far too long. As they drove through the neighborhood, Sandra took in the scenery, the quiet sidewalks, the old houses with porch lights glowing softly, the trees that swayed in the cool evening air, and she felt a strange tenderness blooming in her chest, a realization that this was not just a visit. This was an invitation into the most vulnerable corners of Keanu's world, a silent declaration that she mattered enough for him to share the roots of his story with her. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Keanu sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as if grounding himself, and Sandra watched him with a compassion that softened her entire expression, knowing that for someone like him, someone who carried grief like a shadow and kindness like a shield, introducing her to his parents was not a small gesture. It was a milestone, a quiet but undeniable expression of trust and emotional openness, something more powerful than words. The porch light flickered gently as they stepped out of the car, and the scent of jasmine from the old garden drifted through the air, triggering memories in Keanu's mind. Memories of his mother brewing tea at dusk, his father humming quietly while fixing old things with patient hands, moments of simplicity and love that shaped the foundation of who he had become. Sandra walked beside him, her heartbeat echoing louder with each step, because despite her successful career, her fame, her resilience, and her confidence, she felt a very human nervousness rise within her, the kind that came from wanting to be accepted, wanting to make a good impression, wanting his parents to see her not as an actress or a star, but as someone who genuinely cared for their son. She brushed her hand against his lightly, and he intertwined his fingers with hers in a gesture that was subtle but deeply grounding, and Sandra felt the warmth of his hand settle something inside her, reminding her that no matter what happened inside that house, she wasn't walking in alone. As they reached the door, Keanu paused, closed his eyes briefly, and took a slow breath, as though gathering pieces of courage from every memory that still lived within those walls, and Sandra stood beside him with a steady presence, offering silent support because she knew how much this moment meant and how rare it was for him to allow someone to enter the places he kept locked away from the world. When he finally knocked, the sound echoed softly, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for this meeting that would change everything. Because deep down, both Keanu and Sandra sensed that what waited inside that home was not just a greeting from family, but the unfolding of a deeper truth about who they were becoming together. A truth shaped by love, vulnerability, and the resilience of two souls who had walked through fire in their own lives and somehow found comfort in each other's presence. And when the door opened and warm light spilled onto the porch, framing the silhouette of a gentle, smiling figure who whispered, "Keanu, you're home," Sandra felt her heartbeat stop for just a second, because in that moment she understood that she was not just meeting his parents. She was stepping into a story that would change both of their lives forever. The moment Keanu and Sandra stepped inside, a warmth filled the air that felt almost tangible, like a soft blanket woven from years of stories, laughter, heartbreak, and healing, and Sandra found herself standing in a living room that carried a quiet nostalgia. Family photographs lining the shelves, worn books stacked neatly beside an old lamp, and the faint scent of chamomile tea drifting from the kitchen as if the house itself recognized Keanu's presence and welcomed him home with a gentle embrace. And Sandra, with her observant eyes and gentle heart, felt every detail sinking into her spirit, making her realize that she was witnessing a version of Keanu she had never seen before. A version shaped not by Hollywood lights or red carpets, but by the simplicity of love, loss, and a family that had tried their best through every storm life had thrown their way. His mother stepped forward with a smile full of tenderness, her eyes shining with memories that only a parent carries. Memories of scraped knees, first auditions, heartbreaks survived, laughter shared, and dreams chased with a stubborn courage that sometimes frightened her, and sometimes made her proud beyond words. And she touched Keanu's face gently, as if confirming he was really there, then turned her gaze to Sandra with a kindness that softened the room even more. Making Sandra's breath catch in her throat because she had been prepared for polite greetings, maybe even a bit of distance or the usual polite curiosity people had when meeting someone close to their child. But what she felt instead was an unspoken acceptance, not based on fame or reputation, but on a deep intuition that Sandra cared for Keanu in a way that went beyond superficial affection. Keanu's father emerged moments later, older now, quieter, his face marked by the stories time had written into his skin. And though their relationship had not always been easy, tonight there was no shadow of conflict. Only a humble recognition of the man Keanu had become despite struggles, despite pain, despite the gaps between father and son that had taken years to bridge. And as they exchanged a simple, heartfelt embrace, Sandra watched with an aching tenderness in her chest, aware that this moment was healing something old, something fragile, something unsaid between them. They all moved toward the living room, where soft yellow light spilled across the wooden floor, and Sandra sat beside Keanu on the couch, feeling his quiet nervousness fade slowly as the atmosphere settled into a warm familiarity, and his mother began asking Sandra gentle questions, not the typical Hollywood curiosity, not the invasive probing of someone trying to measure worth, but simple, meaningful questions about her life, her childhood, the things she valued, the moments that shaped her as a person. And Sandra answered with a sincerity that carried her entire history in each word, speaking not as a celebrity, but as a woman who had survived heartbreak, learned resilience, and found solace in kindness more than anything else. Keanu listened silently, his eyes softening as he watched Sandra connect so naturally with his parents, and there was something almost overwhelming about it. The way her voice blended into his home, the way she spoke with humility despite all she had achieved, the way his parents looked at her not with judgment but with a warm acknowledgement that she was someone who saw their son's soul and not just his fame. At one point, his mother placed a hand over Sandra's gently, a gesture so tender it caught Sandra off guard, and she said, "He's been through a lot, more than most people know. Thank you for being someone who brings peace into his life." And Sandra felt her heart swell because she wasn't used to compliments like that, wasn't used to being seen not for her roles or her public image, but for the quiet, unspoken parts of her character that she rarely showed to the world. And Keanu looked down, humbled, touched, his throat tightening with emotions he had tried to hide for years. As the evening continued, stories flowed, some lighthearted, some bittersweet, some filled with laughter that echoed faintly around the room, weaving new memories into the old ones that still lingered in the corners of the house. And Sandra felt herself slowly absorbing the weight of where she was. Inside the heart of Keanu's past, witnessing his vulnerability unfold in a way that deepened her respect and affection for him beyond anything she had expected. When his father spoke about the early years, the struggles, the sacrifices, the disappointments, and the moments when Keanu's determination frightened even him, Sandra couldn't help glancing at Keanu with a new understanding, seeing him not just as the calm, gentle man she knew, but as someone who had carried the burden of hope through difficult paths, someone who had been shaped by the storms he never complained about. Someone whose resilience was born not from privilege, but from emotional battles he rarely discussed. The conversation shifted to Sandra eventually, and Keanu's mother listened with genuine care as Sandra spoke about the challenges of her upbringing, the insecurities she fought behind closed doors, the loneliness that sometimes followed fame like a shadow, and there was a moment, quiet but powerful, when Keanu's father said, "You two understand each other in a way most people never will." And the room fell into a soft silence because it was true. They were two souls shaped by experiences that demanded strength, empathy, and humility. And here, in this living room, surrounded by the simple warmth of family, They both felt something shift gently within them. And as the night deepened, Keanu found himself looking at Sandra with a realization he had never spoken aloud. That bringing her here wasn't just about introducing her to his parents. It was about letting her see the roots of his heart, trusting her with the most sacred part of his life, and the way she fit into this place. Gracefully, honestly, naturally, felt like fate unfolding in slow motion, like a chapter he didn't know he was ready to write but now couldn't imagine walking away from. And Sandra, sitting beside him, felt an unfamiliar sense of belonging, a warmth that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this moment was the beginning of something deeper, something neither of them had planned but both of them had needed for far longer than they realized. As the night settled deeper into the quiet rhythm of the house, a gentle calm washed over the living room, but beneath that calm something profound was beginning to stir, an emotional undercurrent that neither Keanu nor Sandra had anticipated, a moment waiting just beyond the edge of ordinary conversation, and it began when Keanu's mother stood up, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of nostalgia and quiet courage, and said softly that there was something she wanted to show them. Something she hadn't shared with anyone in years. And as she walked toward a wooden cabinet tucked beneath an old painting, Sandra felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the house itself recognized the importance of what was about to unfold and held its breath to listen. Keanu watched closely, his expression tightening with that familiar blend of curiosity and unspoken fear, because his mother rarely opened that cabinet. It held pieces of the past she guarded closely, pieces that carried both beauty and pain, and Sandra, with her sensitive intuition, sensed immediately that whatever was inside would open a window into parts of Keanu's history he rarely touched. His mother returned with a small, carefully wrapped box, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the table, and Sandra could see the weight of the memories pressing against her words as she said, "I've kept this for years, waiting for the right moment." And Keanu's heartbeat thudded softly in his chest, because he knew that tone, knew it meant the past was about to become tangible again. She slowly unwrapped the box, revealing old photographs, pictures of Keanu as a child, laughing, running, holding hands with his mother, learning to play guitar with his father. And Sandra's breath caught as she saw a younger version of the man she had come to admire so deeply, a version untouched by fame, untouched by heartbreak, a version whose innocence radiated from each faded image like sunlight trapped in time. His mother handed Sandra one photograph, a picture of Keanu sitting on a worn-out couch, a small notebook in his lap, writing with an intensity far too deep for his young age. And with a soft whisper she said, "He used to write stories when he couldn't sleep, stories about people finding hope even in the darkest moments." Sandra felt something warm spread through her chest as she studied the photo, because she could see the vulnerability in his eyes even back then, the same quiet depth he carried as an adult, the same longing to make sense of the world through empathy rather than anger. And she turned to look at him with a tenderness that made him avert his gaze because he wasn't used to being seen so completely. Keanu's father leaned forward, his voice soft but steady as he said, "He has always carried more kindness than he knew what to do with. Even when life tried to harden him, he refused to become someone else." And Sandra understood instantly that those words were not just praise. They were a reflection of the emotional battles Keanu had fought quietly, choosing compassion even when the world offered him reasons to become bitter. His mother continued flipping through the photographs, pausing at a picture of Keanu holding a tiny birthday cake for a neighbor's child after her parents forgot her birthday, and she said, "He didn't want her to feel alone. He said no one should feel invisible." And Sandra felt her throat tighten because this gentle, thoughtful boy was the same man who had shown her kindness during her hardest days, the same man who always tried to be a refuge for others even when he had no refuge for himself. Keanu grew visibly uncomfortable, not because he was ashamed, but because he wasn't used to being acknowledged for the quiet goodness he carried. He liked to give without recognition, help without applause, love without expectation, and Sandra reached for his hand gently, her touch grounding him as she whispered, "You've always had a beautiful heart." And for a moment he closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in her voice. His mother then revealed something Sandra didn't expect. Journal entries written by Keanu during one of the most difficult periods of his youth. Pages filled with raw emotions, private thoughts, and reflections about grief, loneliness, and the relentless hope he clung to even when everything around him felt uncertain. And Sandra, listening carefully, felt a deep ache for the boy he once was, a boy who learned too early that silence often hid the deepest pain. yet still chose to believe in love and kindness as if they were lifelines thrown across the darkest waters. There was one entry his mother read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "One day I hope I meet someone who understands the quiet parts of me, someone who doesn't need loud explanations to see I'm trying." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, and Sandra felt them pierce straight into her heart because she realized, with an intensity she couldn't ignore, that she had seen those quiet parts of him, even the ones he tried to hide, and she understood him in a way that felt almost spiritual, as if their souls recognized each other long before either of them dared to acknowledge it. Keanu sat silently, staring at the table, his fingers trembling slightly, and Sandra tightened her hold on his hand, offering silent reassurance while his parents watched the two of them with an emotion neither tried to hide. A mixture of hope and quiet relief, as if they had always prayed he would one day find someone who saw the depth of his spirit without him having to explain it. His father spoke again, this time with a weight that filled the room, saying, "We always worried he gave too much of himself to the world and kept too little for his own happiness." And Sandra felt tears gather in her eyes because she knew exactly what he meant. She had seen Keanu extend his heart to strangers, help people quietly, carry others' pain until his shoulders sagged with invisible weight, yet he rarely allowed anyone to carry his. And now, here they were, sitting in his childhood home, surrounded by memories he had spent years trying to protect. And something inside Sandra shifted, something gentle but undeniable, because she realized she didn't just care for him. She felt responsible for the healing of the parts of him that had been wounded long before she ever stepped into his life. As the night grew deeper, they continued sharing stories, some whispered, some tearful, some full of quiet laughter. And with each passing moment, Sandra felt herself woven deeper into the fabric of Keanu's past, not as an observer, but as someone becoming part of something precious, something real, something that had the power to change them both in ways neither had been prepared for. And as Keanu finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, she saw something unspoken in them, something fragile, hopeful, and full of emotion. And she understood that this night, inside this house filled with memories, wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a truth neither of them would be able to run from anymore. As the emotional weight of the old journals and faded photographs settled into a quiet stillness around them, the house seemed to exhale softly, as if acknowledging that something sacred had just been shared. And Sandra felt herself sitting in the center of a moment that was bigger than she had anticipated. A moment where the past, present, and future all seemed to fold into each other with an almost crushing tenderness. And she realized that this wasn't simply a family evening. It was a confession of who Keanu truly was beneath the calm, steady exterior he carried like armor. And as the room shifted into a more reflective silence, Keanu excused himself briefly, claiming he needed a moment alone, but Sandra sensed more beneath his voice. A familiar tightening of the heart, the kind that comes when someone is overwhelmed by emotions they never expected to confront so suddenly. She watched him disappear down the hallway, and as he left, a subtle tension settled in her chest, a quiet ache because she wanted to follow him, to remind him he wasn't alone in this vulnerability, yet she stayed seated as his mother gently placed a hand on hers, her touch warm, steady, and full of understanding in a way only a mother's touch can be, and with a soft sigh she whispered, "He's always been sensitive, deeper than he lets people see." When old memories surface, they hit him harder than he expects. And Sandra nodded, feeling her own throat tighten with emotion because she had seen that sensitivity in him. Every gentle gesture, every quiet act of kindness, every thoughtful pause before he spoke revealed a heart shaped by both pain and empathy, and she felt all the more protective of him for it. Keanu's father leaned back in his chair, his eyes reflecting years of observation, regret, and pride, and he said, "He carries the world on his shoulders, even when it isn't his to carry, but he has always been that way." And Sandra listened carefully, absorbing every word, every layer of his father's tone, which carried the weight of a man who had learned too late just how deeply his son felt everything. She glanced at the hallway again, her mind swirling with emotions. Gratitude, empathy, tenderness. A growing sense of responsibility she didn't fear but embraced with a sincerity that surprised even her. And then she stood suddenly, compelled by an instinct she couldn't ignore, and murmured softly that she wanted to check on him, and both parents nodded with quiet approval, as if understanding that her presence was what he needed in that moment more than anything else. Sandra walked slowly through the dimly lit corridor, the soft creaking of the wooden floor beneath her feet echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. And as she reached the slightly ajar door at the end, she saw Keanu sitting on the edge of his old bed, his hands clasped together, his head bowed, struggling with a storm of emotions he didn't want to release in front of anyone else. She stepped inside without a word, her presence gentle, steady, unintrusive, and he didn't look up immediately, but she walked closer and sat beside him, their shoulders brushing softly, and after a moment of silence she whispered, "You don't have to hide from me." And those simple words seemed to loosen something inside him, something fragile and long protected, and he finally lifted his head, revealing eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. He let out a slow breath, as if surrendering the weight he had been holding onto, and said quietly, "I didn't expect seeing all of that to hit me this hard. I thought I was past it." And Sandra turned toward him fully, her gaze softening with immense compassion as she replied, "Healing doesn't follow a straight line, Keanu. Sometimes old memories reopen because they want to remind us how far we've come." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see, the kind that came not from weakness but from a depth of feeling most people never understood. And in that moment Sandra felt her heart stretch with a tenderness so deep it almost frightened her. She reached for his hands, enclosing them in hers, and said, "Your past doesn't define you, but it shaped the kindness you carry today. And that's why you are who you are." And he swallowed hard, his chest rising with a trembling breath, and whispered, "I'm not used to someone standing with me in these parts of my life." And Sandra smiled softly, brushing her thumb over his knuckles as she said, "Then let me be the first to stay." Those words hit him like a gentle, unexpected wave, and his face softened with a mixture of relief and disbelief, because deep down he had never expected someone to willingly walk into the quiet, painful corners of his life and stay without hesitation. They sat like that for a moment, hands intertwined, hearts quietly unraveling, until Keanu took a deep breath and said something he had never said aloud. "I've always been afraid that if people saw all the broken pieces, they'd think I wasn't worth staying for." And Sandra felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming desire to protect the man beside her, to wrap his heart in a tenderness he had long been denied, and she leaned closer, her voice trembling with sincerity as she said, "Your broken pieces aren't flaws, Keanu, they're proof of everything you survived, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment he said nothing, only stared at her with an expression that held years of suppressed emotion. And then, as if finally trusting himself to let go, he lowered his forehead gently against hers, their breaths mingling in a quiet, intimate stillness that felt too profound to label. In that fragile closeness, Sandra felt something shift inside him, a surrender, an acceptance, a quiet opening of his heart. And she realized that this night, this vulnerable moment, was transforming their connection into something neither of them could deny anymore. When they finally returned to the living room, hand in hand, his parents exchanged a knowing glance, the kind parents share when they realize their child has finally found someone who doesn't just care, but understands, protects, and heals. And the warmth in their eyes made Sandra's heart swell with an unfamiliar but beautiful sense of belonging. It was in that moment they all understood. This night wasn't simply a visit. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written with honesty, courage, and a love that neither of them had been ready to name, but both of them were slowly learning to trust. As the evening stretched into the quiet hours of night, the warmth of Keanu's childhood home wrapped around Sandra like a soft cocoon. Yet beneath that comforting silence there was a deeper current, an emotional intensity that neither she nor Keanu could ignore any longer, because something about returning to the place where his earliest joys and wounds lived had awakened truths in both of them that had been waiting for the right moment to breathe. And now those truths hovered in the air between them like unspoken confessions. After they returned to the living room, hand in hand, Sandra noticed a subtle shift in Keanu's presence. He seemed lighter somehow, as if her being with him in that vulnerable moment had lifted a weight he didn't know he was still carrying, and his mother watched him with a softness only a mother could have, whispering gently that it had been years since she'd seen that particular light in his eyes. A light that wasn't manufactured for cameras or forced for interviews, but an effortless glow born from being emotionally safe beside someone who understood him without explanation. Sandra felt herself blush slightly under that observation, not because she was embarrassed, but because she realized how deeply she had already become intertwined with his emotional world, and that realization touched her more profoundly than she expected. His father stepped into the kitchen to prepare tea, and Sandra instinctively followed to help, but he stopped her with a warm smile, saying, "You've already given him something far greater than tea tonight." And those simple words lingered in her chest as she turned back toward the living room where Keanu sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of an old wooden table as though grounding himself in memories. He was finally ready to revisit without fear. She walked back to him, sat beside him, and gently nudged his shoulder, and he offered a small smile, one that held gratitude, vulnerability, and an unspoken affection she felt warming her from the inside out. His father returned with steaming cups, and the four of them gathered around the table, sipping tea as the conversation slowly eased into lighter topics. Funny childhood stories. The first time Keanu tried to fix a bicycle and nearly set the garage on fire. Moments of innocence and clumsy courage that made Sandra laugh and made Keanu roll his eyes playfully while quietly attempting to hide his embarrassment. But beneath the humor was a tenderness that softened the room, and Sandra could feel something inside her unfolding with every story, every memory, every glance shared between mother and son. It was as if she were being invited not only into the history of the man she cared for, but into the emotional architecture of his soul. And yet, even in the warmth of these playful stories, Sandra sensed there was something left unsaid, something waiting for its own moment to surface. That moment arrived when his mother placed her cup down and looked at Sandra with a kind seriousness, the kind that carried decades of wisdom, and she asked softly, "Do you want the truth? The truth about what worries us the most when it comes to him?" The room fell still, and Sandra nodded without hesitation, her heartbeat heavy in her chest. His mother took a slow breath before speaking, her voice trembling only slightly. Keanu gives so much of his heart away that sometimes he forgets to keep even a small piece for himself. He'll carry other people's sorrow until it becomes his own, and we've always feared someone might unintentionally take advantage of that kindness. Sandra felt a pang in her heart because she had seen that side of him, the way he listened, the way he cared, the way he absorbed the emotions of everyone around him as if he were built to protect the world even at the cost of his own peace. And she understood instantly how deeply his family loved him, and how fiercely they feared for his quiet spirit in a world that often failed to treat gentle souls with the care they deserved. She reached for Keanu's hand again, not to comfort him, but to assure his parents that he was safe with her, and she said calmly, "I know how the world sees him, but I see the humanity behind it. I see the quiet strength. I see the boy who learned to care even when life didn't care back, and I promise you, I won't ever let his kindness turn into a burden." The sincerity in her voice filled the room with a rare stillness, a sacred quiet that made Keanu's eyes glisten with emotion he didn't try to hide this time. His mother touched Sandra's hand and whispered, "That's all I ever hoped someone would say." But just as the atmosphere settled into that profound acceptance, an unexpected moment unfolded that brought the night to a deeper emotional climax. Keanu stood up abruptly, his eyes shimmering with tears he could no longer hold back, and said, "I need to say something too. Something I've never said to anyone." The room froze as he took a shaky breath, and Sandra felt her chest tighten with anticipation. "I've always feared letting someone close," he began, his voice fragile yet steady. "Not because I didn't want love, but because I was afraid that if someone saw the weight I carry, they would walk away eventually. I've lost people before, and every loss made a part of me believe that maybe I was meant to walk alone." Sandra stood slowly, her heart breaking at the vulnerability of those words, and she moved toward him until they were inches apart, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Keanu, no one is meant to walk alone, and certainly not someone who has spent his life walking beside others' pain." His breath faltered, and he whispered in return, "But what if one day you see something in me that scares you away?" Sandra lifted her hands to his face, her touch soft but unwavering, and she said firmly, "The only thing that scares me is the thought of you continuing to believe you're unworthy of being loved." That sentence broke something open inside him. His breath hitched, and his parents watched with tears in their eyes, witnessing their son finally confronting an emotional wound he had carried for far too long. And in that moment, Sandra did something she had never planned but felt with every part of her heart. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him with a tenderness that felt like home, and he leaned into her quietly, letting himself be held as if his soul had finally found a place to rest. The room was silent except for the quiet sound of their breathing, the soft hum of the house settling into its nighttime stillness, and the unspoken realization that this connection, this bond forming between them, was no longer something fragile or uncertain. It was becoming something profound, something anchored in vulnerability, trust, and emotional truth. When they finally pulled apart, Keanu's parents exchanged a look filled with overwhelming gratitude, as if the universe had finally answered a prayer they had whispered for years. And Sandra, standing there with her heart still trembling, understood that tonight wasn't about meeting his parents or hearing childhood stories. It was about witnessing the deepest part of Keanu's soul and realizing that she had been entrusted with something irreplaceable. As they all sat back down, the night stretching into a calm after an emotional storm, Sandra felt a clarity growing inside her, a certainty that this moment, this evening, this home, and this man were about to change her life in ways she never could have imagined. And she welcomed that change not with fear, but with a quiet, powerful readiness she didn't know she possessed. As the night drifted toward dawn, and the soft early morning light began to seep through the curtains like a gentle promise of new beginnings, Sandra found herself standing by the living room window, watching the sky shift from deep indigo to pale gold, feeling an overwhelming calm blend with an unfamiliar but beautiful sense of certainty, because tonight had revealed not just the private memories of Keanu's past, but the vulnerable truth of his heart, and as she stood there absorbing the quiet. Keanu approached slowly, his steps soft on the wooden floor, stopping beside her with an expression so tender, so open, so untouched by the guardedness he usually carried, that her breath caught in her chest. And he whispered almost shyly, "You stayed through everything tonight," as if he still wasn't sure he deserved the unwavering presence she had given him. Sandra turned to him, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of morning, and said, "I didn't stay because it was easy. I stayed because it felt right." And those words struck him with a gentle force, unraveling layers of fear he didn't know he was still clinging to, and he swallowed hard, looking down for a moment as if gathering courage from the floor beneath his feet, before lifting his gaze with a vulnerability that made Sandra's heart expand with a tenderness she couldn't contain. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said quietly, "and I don't want to pretend that I have everything figured out, but tonight, watching you with my parents, listening to you breathe life into moments I had locked away for years, it made me realize something I've been avoiding for a long time." Sandra waited, her heart pounding with an ache that felt both beautiful and terrifying, and he took a slow breath before continuing. "I've never let anyone stand this close to me, not like this. Not with this much truth, and it scares me, but for the first time it also feels like hope." She stepped closer, feeling her own emotions rising like a tide she could no longer restrain, and she placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady but trembling beat beneath her palm, and she whispered, "Hope isn't something you run from, Keanu. It's something you walk toward even when your legs shake." His eyes softened at her words, and he lifted his hand to gently cover hers, grounding himself in the warmth of her touch. And in that moment everything melted. The fears, the what-ifs, the walls he had built over years of heartbreak and loss. Just then his mother and father entered the room quietly, but instead of interrupting, they paused at a distance, watching the two of them with expressions filled with an emotion deeper than relief. It was the look of parents witnessing a miracle they had long prayed for but never dared to expect. His father stepped forward slowly, reached into his pocket, and held out a small silver pendant shaped like a shield, its edges worn from time, its center engraved with a simple inscription, "For protection in the storms." He pressed it into Keanu's hand and said, his voice steady but thick with meaning, "I gave this to you when you were young because I wanted you to have something to hold on to when life felt too heavy. But now, I want you to give it to someone who helps you carry that weight." Keanu froze, stunned, staring at the pendant as if seeing it for the first time, and Sandra felt tears fill her eyes at the gesture. Because it was more than a gift, more than a symbol. It was a passing of trust from a father who had witnessed his son battle life's hardest moments, to a woman who had shown she would stand beside him through storms he hadn't yet faced. Slowly, with trembling hands and breath unsteady, Keanu turned toward Sandra, and instead of offering the pendant with a grand gesture, he placed it in her hands gently, carefully, as if placing his entire heart there, and he whispered, "I think, for the first time, I'm not afraid to let someone stay." The weight of those words hit her like a tidal wave, not because they were romantic in the traditional sense, but because they were real, raw, vulnerable, the kind of truth that came only after years of closed doors and quiet battles. She closed her fingers around the pendant, holding it against her chest as if absorbing its meaning into her own heartbeat, and whispered, "And I'm not afraid to stay." And when she said it, she meant it with every part of her soul. His mother walked forward and embraced Sandra with a warmth that felt like acceptance and blessing all at once, whispering, "Take care of each other." And Sandra felt tears slipping down her cheeks, not out of sorrow, but out of the overwhelming beauty of being welcomed into a part of someone's life she never expected to become part of. The morning sun finally pushed its way across the horizon, casting a golden glow over the room, and for a moment everything felt suspended in a perfect, fragile silence. A silence filled with new beginnings, unspoken promises, and the first threads of a bond that would only grow stronger with time. As they prepared to leave, Keanu walked Sandra to the car, his steps slow, reluctant, as if each one marked the closing of a chapter he wished he could hold onto forever. But as they reached the car, he turned to her with an expression that held every emotion of the night: fear, hope, gratitude, and a love he hadn't yet named but couldn't hide anymore, and he said softly, "Thank you for seeing me." Sandra touched his face gently, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I didn't see a celebrity. I saw a man with a beautiful heart, and I'm not going anywhere." He pulled her into a quiet embrace, a kind of embrace that didn't ask for anything but offered everything: comfort, trust, healing, and in that moment both of them understood that something had changed forever. When they drove away hand in hand, the pendant resting between them on the seat like a promise from the universe, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, pulsing with a connection born from vulnerability and strengthened by truth. And as the house disappeared behind them, Sandra knew with absolute certainty that tonight hadn't just changed Keanu's relationship with his parents. It had changed the way they saw each other, the way they stood with each other, the way they would move forward from this moment on. Because in that home filled with memories, they had created a new one. A memory that whispered of healing, of hope, of hearts learning to trust again, and of two souls finally realizing that they no longer needed to walk alone.